Frank Miller lived alone in his small farmhouse, spending his days tending to his vegetable garden since his wife passed away. One rainy evening, he heard a terrible crash outside his property. Without hesitation, he grabbed his flashlight and rushed to help. There, in the overturned car, was an unconscious woman needing his help. As he held her hand, waiting for the ambulance, something about her seemed familiar. He wouldn't realize until later that she was Elizabeth James, the woman he had loved 50 years ago, before life took them down different paths. Sometimes, the heart remembers what the mind has forgotten. Earlier that morning, before fate intervened, Frank had been doing what he did every day since Sarah's passing. He sat at his weathered kitchen table, morning light streaming through the window, carefully turning the pages of Sarah's garden journal. The leather-bound notebook, its corners soft from years of use, contained more than just planting schedules and harvest notes. It held their shared dreams, written in Sarah's neat handwriting. "Remember, Frank," she had written on the last page, just months before the cancer took her. "Gardens aren't meant to be perfect. They're meant to be lived in, loved, and shared." He ran his fingers over the words, feeling the slight indentations. Her pen had left in the paper. 15 years had passed, but some mornings the loss felt as fresh as yesterday. The garden had become his sanctuary, his way of keeping Sarah's memory alive while finding his own path forward. Rising from the table, Frank pulled on his work boots and headed outside. The morning air carried the promise of rain, but that had never stopped him before. His garden was the talk of the neighborhood, not the manicured kind you'd find in magazines, but a living, breathing space that welcomed everyone. Neighborhood children knew they could always stop by for fresh cherry tomatoes, and elderly Mrs. Peterson from next door had a standing invitation to pick herbs for her Sunday roasts. The senior center had even asked him to help start a community garden project. He'd been hesitant at first. Sarah had always been the one who was good with people, but something about her journal entries kept pushing him to say yes. "Life grows where you plant it," she'd written. And Frank was beginning to understand she hadn't just meant vegetables. As he worked among the neat rows, his mind drifted to the upcoming senior center meeting. They wanted him to teach a gardening class, share what he'd learned over the years. The thought both terrified and excited him. Sarah would have loved it. She always said he had a gift for explaining things, even if he didn't believe it himself. A light drizzle began to fall, but Frank continued working. The rain reminded him of afternoons spent with Sarah, both of them refusing to come inside until they'd finished whatever project they'd started. She'd laugh at his muddy clothes, then show up with hot tea and fresh-baked cookies. Now he made his own tea, not quite as good as hers, but the routine helped. The garden had changed since Sarah's time. He'd added raised beds to make the work easier on his back, installed a small greenhouse for winter growing, and created what he called the Remembrance Corner, a peaceful spot with a bench surrounded by Sarah's favorite flowers. But the heart of it remained the same, a place where life flourished, where memories lived in every bloom and harvest. As evening approached, the drizzle strengthened into a steady rain. Frank made one final check of the cucumber vines before heading inside. He'd just settled into his favorite chair, Sarah's journal open on his lap to review next month's planting schedule, when he heard the crash. The sound of twisting metal shattered the evening's peace. Frank was moving before his mind had fully processed what he'd heard, muscle memory from years of farm accidents taking over. He grabbed the flashlight he always kept by the door, a habit Sarah had instilled in him, and rushed out into the rain. The crash site wasn't hard to find. Just beyond his property line, where the country road curved sharply, a car had skidded off the pavement. It lay on its side in the drainage ditch, headlights still burning through the rain. The sight sent Frank back 40 years to his days as a volunteer firefighter, but he pushed the memories aside. Someone needed help now. "Hello? Can you hear?" "Me," he called out, approaching the vehicle carefully. The rain was coming down harder now, making the grass slick under his boots. He could see a single occupant through the driver's side window, a woman, slumped forward against her seatbelt, silver hair catching the beam of his flashlight. Up in his attic, tucked away in a box he hadn't opened in decades, was his high school yearbook from 1968. If he'd looked at it recently, he might have recognized something in the unconscious woman's face. A ghost of the girl who'd once written poetry for the school literary magazine, who'd worn daisies in her hair during that endless summer before college separated them. But right now, all Frank saw was someone who needed help. He tested the door handle. Locked. The passenger side was more accessible with the car on its side. "Ma'am, I'm going to get you out. Help is coming." He'd already dialed 911, the phone, propped between his shoulder and ear as he worked. The passenger window had shattered, leaving a safe entry point. Frank cleared away the loose glass, his movements deliberate and careful, despite the urgency thrumming through his veins. The dispatcher's voice crackled from his phone, promising emergency services were en route. "Stay with me," he called to the woman as he maneuvered through the window. The interior of the car smelled of airbag powder and something sweet, lavender maybe, the same scent that used to drift from the poetry club room during lunch period, though that connection wouldn't surface in Frank's mind until much later. He reached her carefully, checking her pulse the way he'd been trained, strong and steady, thank goodness. In the cramped space, he could see a small cut on her forehead, but no other obvious injuries. The airbag had done its job. Her skin was warm under his fingers as he checked for signs of neck injury, and something about that touch sent an unexpected jolt through him. A feeling like déjà vu, but deeper. "Can you hear me?" he asked again. Gentler now, her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. The rain drummed on the car's undercarriage, creating an odd metallic rhythm. Frank kept talking, mostly to keep himself focused. "I'm Frank. You're going to be okay, just a little accident, and help is almost here." He held her hand while they waited, both to monitor her pulse and to offer what comfort he could. Her fingers were slender, wearing rings. One looked like a wedding band, the other set with a small pearl. Something stirred in his memory, an image of another pearl ring chosen from a jeweler's window 5 decades ago. But the thought slipped away as sirens began to wail in the distance. The next few minutes were a blur of activity. Paramedics arrived, then firefighters. Frank gave his statement to a young deputy while the rescue team worked to stabilize and extract the woman. He found himself reluctant to leave, watching as they finally freed her and transferred her to a waiting ambulance. "Sir," one of the paramedics approached him. "We're taking her to County General. She's stable but still unconscious. You did good work here." Frank nodded, suddenly aware of how soaked and muddy he was. "Will she be all right?" "Looks promising. Are you family?" "No, just a neighbor. Heard the crash." The paramedic smiled. "Well, she's lucky you did. We've got your details if we need anything else." Frank watched the ambulance pull away, its lights painting. The rain, red and white. He should have felt relieved. He'd done what needed doing. Help had arrived. The emergency was over. But something kept nagging at him, like a word on the tip of his tongue or a face glimpsed in a crowd. Back in his house, changing out of his wet clothes, Frank found himself thinking about that yearbook in the attic. He hadn't looked at it since Sarah's passing. Hadn't looked at it much before that, if he was honest. But tonight, for some reason, it was calling to him. Frank hadn't planned on going to the hospital. He'd done his part, he told himself, standing in his living room, now dry but still restless. The yearbook could wait. She was in good hands. He should get some sleep. Instead, he found himself in his truck, driving through the rain to County General. The waiting room was quiet at this hour, just a few people scattered across the vinyl chairs. A stack of old magazines sat on a corner table, their covers worn and curling. One caught his Love After Loss, Finding Your Way Back to Joy. He picked it up, then set it down again quickly, as if it had burned him. "Excuse me." He approached the information desk. "There was a car accident victim brought in about an hour ago. I'm the one who found her." The receptionist looked up. Kindly. "Are you family?" "No, I just Frank paused. How could he explain this pull he felt, this nagging sense that he needed to make sure she was all right? "I was there when it happened." "Mr. Miller?" a voice called from behind him, one of the paramedics from the scene. "I thought you might show up. Come with me." They walked through quiet corridors, their footsteps echoing on the linoleum. Her daughter's on her way from Portland," the paramedic explained. "She's stable but still unconscious. CT scan looks good, though. No major head trauma." Frank nodded, relief washing over him. "Has anyone identified her yet?" "Elizabeth James. Lives about 30 miles from here." The name hit Frank like a physical blow, but the paramedic didn't notice, still talking. "We found her purse in the car. Lucky thing she had her emergency contacts up to date." Elizabeth James. Lizzie, the girl who'd worn daisies in her hair and written poems about summer storms. The one who'd left for college back east while he stayed to help his father with the farm. The one he'd thought about writing to 1,000 times before life carried him in other directions. Before he could process this revelation, a new voice broke through his thoughts. "Dad, what are you doing here?" His daughter Grace stood in the hallway, still in her nurse's scrubs. She worked at County General, but he hadn't expected her to be on shift tonight. The familiar sight of her helped ground him. "There was an accident near the house," he explained. "I helped until the ambulance came." Grace's expression softened. "Of course you did. That's just like you." She checked her tablet. "Room 312. I'm not her assigned nurse, but I can tell you she's doing well. They expect her to wake up soon." Frank hesitated. "Her daughter's coming." "From Portland, yes. Jennifer James. She called ahead. Should be here in about an hour." Grace studied her father's face. "Dad, do you know them?" The memory of that last summer day in 1968 rose unbidden. "I might have once, a long time ago." Grace touched his arm gently. "Stay, at least until her daughter gets here. No one should wake up alone in a hospital." So Frank found himself in a chair beside Elizabeth's bed, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest, listening to the quiet beep of monitors. She'd aged, of course. They both had. But he could still see traces of the girl he'd known. The slight curl of her hair, the delicate line of her jaw. A magazine lay forgotten in his lap. He'd grabbed it from the waiting room without really thinking. Its cover story about reconnecting with lost loves seemed to mock him now. Life wasn't like those stories, he told himself. People changed. 50 years was a lifetime. But his hand moved of its own accord to cover hers where it lay on the blanket. And when her fingers twitched slightly in his grip, something that had been sleeping in his heart for half a century stirred and opened its eyes. The first sign was a slight pressure on his hand, her fingers tightening almost imperceptibly around his. Frank leaned forward, heart suddenly racing. A soft moan escaped her lips as her eyelids fluttered. "Elizabeth," he whispered, surprising himself by using her name. Her eyes opened slowly, confusion clouding their brown depths. She blinked several times, focusing first on the hospital room, then on him. Frank watched as awareness gradually returned to her face. "Where?" Her voice was hoarse. "County General. There was an accident, but you're going to be fine." Frank reached for the water cup the nurses had left. "Small sips," he instructed, helping her drink. As she settled back against the pillows, her eyes never left his face. Something shifted in her expression, recognition dawning like a slow sunrise. Her free hand moved to her purse on the bedside table, fingers trembling as she withdrew an aged envelope. Frank's breath caught. He knew that envelope, or rather one just like it. He'd written dozens of letters during that first semester apart, but had never sent them. Too proud, too afraid, too convinced that letting her go was the right thing. The envelope she held was equally unsent, the address written in familiar flowing script that had once filled margins with poetry. Elizabeth James to Frank Miller, dated September 1968. "I was going to mail it," she said softly. "I wrote one every week that first month, but then I heard about Sarah Cooper and—" She trailed off, eyes filling with tears. Frank remembered. Sarah had been there when he needed someone to talk to about Lizzie leaving. One conversation led to another, and eventually to 42 years of happy marriage. He wouldn't trade those years for anything, but sitting here now, holding Elizabeth's hand, he felt the weight of all their unspoken words. "Your wife?" Elizabeth asked gently. "The nurses mentioned 15 years ago. Cancer." Frank's thumb traced unconscious patterns on her hand. "And your husband?" "John. 3 years now. Heart attack." She smiled sadly. "He was a good man. We had a wonderful life." A comfortable silence fell between them, filled with the gentle beeping of monitors and the distant sounds of hospital activity. Frank thought about the letter in his attic, tucked into that yearbook he'd never quite been able to throw away. "Mom?" They both looked up to see a woman in her 40s standing in the doorway, worry etched on her face. Jennifer James, Elizabeth's daughter. Frank started to pull his hand away, but Elizabeth held on. "Jenny," she smiled, "come meet Frank." Miller, she glanced at him, years of memories passing between them in that look. "He saved my life tonight." "Mr. Miller," Jennifer rushed forward, "the paramedics told me what you did. Thank you so much." Frank stood somewhat awkwardly, but Elizabeth still wouldn't release his hand. "Anyone would have done the same." "But it wasn't anyone," Elizabeth said softly. "It was you." Grace appeared in the doorway, having noticed the activity in the room. She took in the scene, her father and Elizabeth holding hands, the old envelope on the bed, Jennifer's grateful tears, and something clicked. "Dad," she asked. "Is this—" Frank nodded, unable to find the words. How could he explain that the woman he'd pulled from a crashed car was the same one whose memory had lived in the back of his mind for 50 years? That fate or chance or whatever you wanted to call it had brought them full circle. Elizabeth saved him from trying. "Your father and I were close once, a lifetime ago." She squeezed his hand. "But maybe some stories aren't finished as soon as we think they are." The next morning brought weak sunlight and a flurry of medical activity. Elizabeth was doing well. No serious injuries beyond bruising and mild concussion. Frank had gone home briefly to tend his garden, but found himself drawn back to the hospital, this time carrying a worn photo album he'd discovered while looking for that old yearbook. He found Elizabeth sitting up in bed, Jennifer and Grace both perched on chairs nearby. The two daughters had struck up an immediate friendship, sharing stories about growing up with parents who never quite explained their old photographs. "Look what Jenny found," Elizabeth said as Frank entered. She held up a faded photograph, their high school graduating class, everyone looking impossibly young and serious in their caps and gowns. "We were just explaining to the girls about that summer." Frank settled into the remaining chair, placing his album on the bed. 1968, he said softly. "Seems like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once." Jennifer leaned forward. "Mom never talked much about high school, just that she went east for college. And Dad stayed to help with the farm," Grace added, glancing at her father. Elizabeth touched the photograph gently. "We thought we had everything figured out. I was going to study literature at Wellesley, become a famous poet. Frank was going to modernize his family's farm, make it a model of sustainable agriculture before that was even a term. Life had other plans," Frank said, opening his album. Inside were more photographs. Elizabeth reading poetry at a school, assembly, Frank showing a prize cow at the county fair, both of them at the senior prom. The writing club meetings, Elizabeth remembered smiling. "You'd sit in the back pretending to study, but I knew you were listening to every word. Your poems were worth listening to." Frank's voice was soft with memory. "I still remember the one about the storm coming across the valley." Elizabeth's eyes widened. "You remember that? Like giants walking through the clouds, their footsteps echoing in thunder," he quoted. "How could I forget?" Grace and Jennifer exchanged glances, seeing their parents in a new light. The photograph album revealed page after page of shared moments, moments that had shaped two lives before sending them in different directions. "What happened?" Jennifer asked gently. "Why didn't you stay in touch?" Elizabeth's hand found Frank's again, a gesture becoming familiar. Pride, mostly. Fear. The distance seemed so vast back then. I got caught up in college life, made new friends. Then I met John. And I met Sarah, Frank continued. She helped me transform the farm into something new. We were happy, both of us, in our separate lives. He looked at Elizabeth. No regrets? No regrets, she agreed. John gave me a beautiful life, a wonderful daughter, but she trailed off, looking at the photographs. But some doors never quite close, Frank finished. Grace picked up the album, studying a picture of her father and Elizabeth at a harvest festival. That's why you always insisted on having the festival. Every year, isn't it, Dad? Even after Mom passed away, Frank nodded. Sarah knew about Elizabeth about that summer. She's the one who convinced me to keep the festival going, said traditions were important, even if their meanings change. John knew too, Elizabeth added. Men like that, they understand about first loves. They're secure enough to honor them, without feeling threatened. Jennifer wiped away a tear. He used to say Mom's heart was big enough for all her loves, past and present. I never quite understood what he meant until now. The afternoon light shifted, casting long shadows across the hospital bed. The photo album lay open between them, a bridge across 50 years of separate lives now intersecting again. I have something to show you, Frank said, reaching for his jacket. When I went home, I finally found that yearbook, and inside it, he pulled out an envelope, matching the one Elizabeth had shown him yesterday. Elizabeth's breath caught. You kept it too? Some things you just can't throw away, he said simply. The doctors wanted to keep Elizabeth under observation for another day, concerned about the mild concussion. She sat in her hospital bed, absently turning her wedding ring, a simple gold band that had been John's mother's before his. The familiar motion brought comfort as she processed everything that had happened. Frank visited twice that day, first in the morning with fresh flowers from his garden, then again in the evening after the day's tests were done. They talked for hours, filling in the gaps of 50 years with stories of triumph and loss, joy and sorrow. John loved to sail, Elizabeth said, showing Frank pictures on her phone of a smiling man with kind eyes standing at the helm of a small boat. We spent every summer exploring the coast. He taught Jennifer to navigate by the stars. Sarah was the same with horses, Frank replied. She and Grace would disappear for whole weekends on trails. I packed their lunches and waited for the stories they'd bring back. The sharing of these memories felt sacred somehow, not a betrayal of their past loves, but an honoring. Elizabeth watched Frank's face as he talked about Sarah, saw the tenderness there, and felt grateful that they'd both known such deep love. Your garden, she said during a lull in conversation. Jenny says it's beautiful. It helps me think. Sarah always said I did my best thinking with my hands in the dirt. He paused. Would you like to see it? Once you're released, I mean. The doctors mentioned you shouldn't be alone while recovering. The offer hung in the air between them. Elizabeth touched her wedding ring again, thinking of John. He would have understood this moment, would have encouraged it even. He'd always told her that love wasn't a finite resource. I'd like that, she said softly. If you're sure, there's a guest room. Grace helped me set it up years ago, but it doesn't get much use. Frank's eyes crinkled with his smile. The garden could use a poet's perspective. Jennifer arrived later with a small suitcase of clothes and necessities. She'd been staying at Elizabeth's house, sorting through the crash aftermath with insurance companies and mechanics. The car's totaled, she reported. But that's what insurance is for. How are you feeling about staying with Mr. Miller? Elizabeth smiled at her daughter's protective tone. Frank, she corrected gently. And yes, I'm sure. It makes sense while I'm recovering. It's more than that, though, isn't it? Jennifer sat on the edge of the bed. I saw how you look at each other, how you talk about the past. Jenny, Elizabeth began, but her daughter shook her head. Mum, it's okay. Dad would want you to be happy, to be cared for. She took her mother's hand. Love doesn't end just because someone's gone. It just changes shape. Elizabeth squeezed her daughter's hand, remembering all the times John had said something similar. He'd been wise that way, understanding the heart's capacity for growth. That evening, as Frank was leaving, he paused in the doorway. "I'll pick you up tomorrow after they release you." Grace already cleared it with the doctors. "Frank," Elizabeth called as he turned to go, "thank you, not just for this, but for remembering the poem about the storm, everything." He smiled, and for a moment she saw the boy who used to sit in the back of writing club, pretending not to listen. "Some things stay with you," he said simply, "no matter how many years pass." Frank's kitchen felt different with Elizabeth in it. He watched as she explored the space, running her fingers along the wooden countertops, examining the herbs drying in bundles by the window. She'd been quiet during the drive from the hospital, both of them aware of the strange intimacy of what they were doing. "You still bake," she observed, noticing the recipe box on the shelf. A simple wooden thing he'd made decades ago, now filled with both his and Sarah's recipes. The cards inside were a history of their marriage. Sarah's elegant handwriting describing holiday dishes, his practical notes on bread and simple meals, their daughter Grace's early attempts at recording her own culinary experiments. "Sarah taught me," he admitted. "Said if I was going to eat, I ought to know how to feed myself properly." He opened the box, shuffling through the cards. "Though these days I mostly stick to the basics." Elizabeth picked up one of the recipe cards, smiling at the detailed instructions. John was the same way about sailing. "If you're going to be on my boat," he'd say, "you need to know how to bring her home." She set the card back carefully. He was right too. After he passed, being able to take the boat out alone, it helped. Frank understood. After Sarah died, the garden had been his sanctuary. Speaking of which, would you like to see the garden before it gets dark? The evening light was golden as they stepped outside. Elizabeth moved carefully, still sore from the accident, but her eyes lit up at the sight before her. The garden was in its late summer glory, tomatoes heavy on the vine, dahlias nodding in the breeze, herbs sending up their gentle fragrance. "It's beautiful," she breathed, "like something out of a story." "There's a bench," Frank offered, gesturing to the sitting area he'd created in what he called the Remembrance Corner. "Sarah's roses are just starting their second bloom." They sat together, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sound of birds settling for the night. "I used to write poems about moments like this," Elizabeth said softly, "but I haven't written anything since John died. The words wouldn't come." Frank thought about the years after Sarah's passing, how the garden had seemed simultaneously like too much to handle and the only thing keeping him grounded. "Maybe," he suggested carefully, "you just needed new moments to write about." She turned to look at him, really look at him, and he saw in her eyes the same mix of emotions he felt: gratitude for the love they'd known, grief for what they'd lost, and something new, something neither of them had expected to find at this stage of life. "Grace called while you were signing the discharge papers," he said after a moment. "She's bringing dinner. Jennifer too. They've become quite the team." Elizabeth laughed softly. "They're making sure we're not alone in this, whatever this is." The screen door creaked. A sound so familiar Frank usually didn't notice it anymore. But tonight, with Elizabeth beside him, every detail felt significant. Grace and Jennifer appeared, carrying takeout containers and bottles of wine. "We thought Italian would be good," Grace announced, leading the way to the kitchen. "Easy to reheat if anyone's not hungry yet." The kitchen filled with warm aromas and gentle conversation as they set up dinner. Frank found himself hanging back, slightly watching as Elizabeth helped Jennifer find plates, as Grace opened wine, as his quiet house came alive with voices and laughter. "Okay?" Elizabeth asked quietly, appearing at his side. He nodded, thinking of Sarah's recipe box, of John's sailing lessons, of all the ways love teaches us to navigate life's changes. "More than okay," he said, and meant it. Morning arrived with gentle persistence. Sunlight filtering through the guest room curtains, Elizabeth woke slowly, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar space. The room was simple but thoughtfully arranged. fresh flowers on the dresser, a stack of books on the bedside table, a comfortable reading chair by the window. She found Frank already in the garden, working in the cool morning air. He'd set up a new bench, she noticed, not in the remembrance corner with its roses, but in a sunny spot near the herb garden. The old wooden bench had appeared sometime after dinner last night, carried from his workshop while she slept. "I thought you might like a place to sit and write," he explained when he saw her, slightly self-conscious. "If you want to, that is. No pressure." Elizabeth touched the smooth wood, weathered by years but solid. "You kept it," she said softly. It was their bench, the one they'd sat on during writing club meetings half a century ago, when she'd read her poems and he'd pretended not to be moved by them. It's been in the workshop all these years. Sarah used it sometimes when she wanted to watch me garden. He wiped his hands on his jeans. She knew about it, about you, about everything. Elizabeth settled onto the bench, feeling the familiar contours that had somehow survived decades of storage. John knew, too. I told him early on about the boy who listened to poetry and built things with his hands. He said he was glad I'd known that kind of love, even if it wasn't meant to last. Frank sat beside her, careful to leave space between them. Was that what happened? It wasn't meant to last. "We were so young," Elizabeth said, watching a butterfly dance through the herb garden. College seemed like such an insurmountable distance. And we both had dreams, big dreams that pulled us in different directions. "You wanted to change the world with words," Frank remembered. "I wanted to revolutionize farming practices. And we did, in our own ways. You have this garden, your community work. I taught literature to 3 generations of students." She smiled. "Not quite what we planned, but good lives," Frank finished. "Lives worth living." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the garden wake up. A hummingbird darted among the flowers, pausing at each bloom. "I used to imagine," Elizabeth said slowly, "what would have happened if I'd stayed, or if you'd come east. But then I look at our children, think about the lives we've lived, and I can't regret the paths we chose." "Sarah used to say everything happens in its own time," Frank replied. "Maybe some stories need 50 years to find their ending, or their beginning," Elizabeth suggested softly. Frank turned to look at her, really look at her, seeing both the girl she'd been and the woman she'd become. "I kept every article about your teaching career that I could find," he admitted. "Sarah helped me clip them from the education section. She said it was important to celebrate old friends' successes." "John had a folder of agricultural innovations," Elizabeth laughed. "He followed your work with sustainable farming practices. Said he liked knowing you were out there, making the world better in your own way." The morning sun climbed higher, warming the bench. From inside the house came the smell of coffee. Grace must have arrived early, as she'd promised. "They're watching over us, aren't they?" Elizabeth asked, touching her wedding ring. "Sarah and John, making sure we're not alone." Frank nodded, thinking of Sarah's recipe box, of John's sailing lessons, of all the ways love continues to teach and guide. "They knew us best," he said. "Maybe they understood something we're just figuring out." The garden bench had become their confession booth, a place where past and present could safely intertwine. 50 years of separate lives were beginning to weave together, not erasing what had been, but creating something new. A week after the accident, the community center was hosting its annual harvest dance. Frank found the ticket stub from their last dance together, 1968's end of summer celebration, tucked into that old yearbook, its edges soft with age. He'd been turning it over in his hands all morning, wondering if it was too soon to ask Elizabeth to accompany him. She solved his dilemma at breakfast, looking up from the newspaper's community section. "The harvest dance is tonight," she said casually. "Grace mentioned you never miss it." "Sarah loved to dance," he replied, then hesitated. Would you like to go?" Elizabeth's smile held a touch of mischief. "Do you still know the box step?" "Some things you don't forget," he said, returning her smile. The community center had been transformed, twinkling lights and autumn decorations creating a warm atmosphere. Frank felt oddly nervous as they walked in, Elizabeth's hand resting lightly on his arm. They'd spent a week sharing quiet meals and garden conversations, but this was different. This was public. Heads turned as they entered. Elizabeth was still technically his houseguest, recovering from the accident, but small towns have a way of knowing things. The whispers were gentle, mostly approving. After all, both Frank and Elizabeth were well respected in the community. Mrs. Peterson, Frank's elderly neighbor, was the first to approach them. "Elizabeth, Frank told us you were staying with him, but he didn't mention how lovely you look." She winked at Frank, though I'm sure he noticed. Before either could respond, the band struck up a familiar tune, Moon River, the same song that had played at that long-ago summer dance. Elizabeth's hand tightened slightly on Frank's arm. "Would you like to dance?" he asked softly. They moved together, as if the intervening years melted away, muscle memory taking over. Elizabeth still fit perfectly in his arms, though now there was a lifetime of experience in how they held each other. "People are watching," she murmured, amused. "Let them," Frank replied. "We've earned this dance." As they swayed to the music, other couples joined the floor. Grace and Jennifer arrived together, pausing to watch their parents with matching smiles before joining the dancing themselves. "John and I used to practice dancing on the boat," Elizabeth said suddenly. "He said if you could waltz on a rolling deck, you could dance anywhere." Frank chuckled. "Sarah made me practice in the garden, said the uneven ground would improve my balance." The mention of their late spouses felt natural now, a shared understanding of how love grows and changes. The dance floor was full of similar stories, widows and widowers who'd found friendship or more, couples who'd weathered life's storms together, young people just beginning their journeys. During a break between songs, they found themselves surrounded by well-wishers. The story of how Frank had rescued Elizabeth from the crash had spread, gaining a romantic gloss in the retelling. The truth that fate or chance had reunited long-lost first loves was even better. "You know what this reminds me of?" Elizabeth asked as they swayed to another slow song. She nodded toward the old ticket stub peeking from Frank's pocket. "The last dance before I left for college. You promised me then that you'd never forget how to dance." "I kept that promise," Frank said softly, among others. The evening wrapped them in its gentle magic, familiar music, warm lights, the comfort of community. They were no longer teenagers stealing glances across a crowded gym, but something better, two people who had lived full lives and found each other again at exactly the right moment. The morning after the dance, Frank found Sarah's last letter while organizing his desk drawer. He'd read it countless times over the years, her final words, written when she knew she wouldn't see another spring. Today, though, the familiar words held new meaning. "My dearest Frank," she'd written in shaky handwriting, "don't let my memory become a wall around your heart. You have too much love to give. When the time is right, and if the right person comes along, know that you have my blessing. Your happiness was always my greatest joy." He sat in his study, letter in hand, listening to the soft sounds of Elizabeth moving around the kitchen. She'd insisted on making breakfast, said she couldn't let him do all the cooking just because she was still technically recovering. "Coffee's ready," she called. In the kitchen, morning sunlight streamed through windows that had never seemed quite so bright before. Elizabeth had found his collection of mismatched mugs, choosing Sarah's favorite blue one for herself. The sight made his heart twist, not unpleasantly. "I found something," he said, settling at the table. "Something Sarah wrote before." He placed the letter carefully between them. Elizabeth sat down, her own expression thoughtful. "I have one too," she admitted, "from John. He made me promise to read it a year after." She touched her wedding ring. "He knew me so well, knew I'd need time, but not too much time." Frank watched as she read Sarah's words, saw the tears gather in her eyes. "She was a remarkable woman," Elizabeth said softly. "So was John," Frank replied. They both understood something about love that maybe were just learning. Elizabeth reached for her purse, pulling out a carefully folded paper. "Would you like to read it?" John's letter was different in style, but similar in spirit. He'd written about the joy Elizabeth had brought to his life, about his hopes for her future, about his certainty that love wasn't a finite resource, but a growing force. "My darling," he'd written, "don't let fear of betraying my memory keep you from embracing joy when it finds you. You taught me that hearts are infinitely expandable. Now let yourself believe it too." They sat in silence. 2 letters between them. 2 lives of love, supporting what was growing between them now. Outside, birds visited the garden feeders, and the morning light painted everything in gentle gold. "I've been feeling guilty," Elizabeth confessed, "not about being here, but about how right it feels, about how watching you garden makes my heart light, about wanting to hold your hand during the dance." Frank reached across the table, taking her hand. "I know, I feel it too, but Sarah was right, and so was John. Love doesn't divide when you share it. It multiplies." "Grace said something similar yesterday," Elizabeth smiled. "She said seeing us together doesn't diminish her memories of Sarah. If anything, it makes them more precious. Jennifer says John would have loved you, would have insisted on teaching you to sail." She squeezed his hand. "She's probably right." Frank thought about that, about how lives interweave, about how love echoes through generations. "Sarah would have joined your poetry club," he said, "would have demanded readings in the garden." They laughed together, the sound carrying no hint of betrayal or guilt. Their late spouses' letters lay on the table between them, not as barriers, but as bridges, helping them navigate this unexpected chapter of their lives. The local newspaper sat on Frank's kitchen table, open to a yellowed clipping from 1968. "Young love blooms at Valley High," the headline read, accompanying a photo of the Creative Writing Club. In it, a teenage Elizabeth read from her poetry journal, while Frank watched from the back row, trying and failing to hide his admiration. Margaret Chen, the current editor of the town paper and daughter of Frank's old friend, had discovered the clipping while digitizing their archives. Now she sat across from Frank and Elizabeth, notepad ready, eyes bright with curiosity. "Dad always said you two had the kind of connection people write stories about," Margaret said, touching the old photograph. "He'd be thrilled to know he was right." Elizabeth glanced at Frank, seeking his opinion. They'd known this moment would come. Small towns run on stories, and theirs was too good to ignore. The question was how much to share. "It's not just about us," Frank said carefully. "Sarah and John are part of this story too." Margaret nodded, understanding. "That's exactly why people need to hear it. In a world of disposable relationships, you've shown how love can evolve, deepen, resurface, how it's possible to honor the past while embracing the future." Elizabeth reached for Frank's hand under the table. "What do you think?" He thought about Sarah's letter, about John's wisdom, about the way their children had embraced this unexpected development. "Maybe it's time," he said softly. So they told their story, about young love and difficult choices, about the lives they'd built separately, about the accident that brought them back together. Margaret's pen flew across her notepad, capturing every detail. "The Garden Club ladies are already calling it a real-life Nicholas Sparks novel," Margaret chuckled. "They say it gives them hope." "Hope?" Elizabeth asked. "That life can surprise you at any age, that love doesn't have an expiration date." Margaret gestured to the old photograph, that sometimes the end of one chapter is just the beginning of another. After she left, Frank and Elizabeth sat in comfortable silence, looking at the old newspaper clipping. Their younger selves stared back, unaware of the journey ahead. "We were so young," Elizabeth mused, "so certain we had everything figured out." "And now?" Frank asked, studying her face. "Now I know enough to know I don't have anything figured out," she smiled, "except that this feels right." The phone rang, Jennifer, calling to warn them that the story was already spreading through her social media circles. "Mum, you're trending in our hometown Facebook group," she laughed. "People are sharing their own memories of you two from high school." Grace arrived later with takeout, having seen the buzz online. "The hospital staff can't stop talking about it," she reported. "They're calling it the most romantic rescue ever." Frank groaned. "It wasn't like that. I just helped someone in need. Someone you happened to have loved 50 years ago," Grace pointed out. "Someone who by pure chance turned out to be your first love. Dad, you have to admit it's pretty remarkable." Elizabeth picked up the newspaper clipping. "Life writes better stories than we ever could," she said softly, "even if they take 50 years to unfold." Elizabeth's recovery journal lay open on her bedside table, the latest entry unfinished. "Dizziness returned today," she'd written. "Frank noticed before I did. Saw me stumble in the garden. Sometimes I think he knows me better after 3 weeks than people I've known for years." The words trailed off there, interrupted by the episode that had sent them back to the hospital. Now Frank sat beside her bed again, but this time was different. This time he knew exactly who he was worried about. "Post-concussion syndrome," the doctor had explained. "Sometimes symptoms can worsen before they get better. We'd like to keep her overnight for observation." Frank held Elizabeth's hand, watching her sleep. The monitors beeped steadily, reminiscent of that first night, but now each sound carried more weight. In just 3 weeks, she'd become essential to his world in ways he hadn't thought possible at their age. "Dad?" Grace appeared in the doorway, still in her nurse's scrubs. "How is she?" "Sleeping," he said softly. "The doctor says it's normal, but you're worried." Grace pulled up another chair. "I saw her journal when I was helping her settle in. She writes about you, you know." Frank looked up, surprised. "She does? About how you've given her back her words, how watching you in the garden makes her want to write poetry again." Grace smiled. "She's good for you too, Dad. I haven't seen you this alive since Mom." The mention of Sarah didn't hurt the way it once had. Instead, it felt right, like all of this was somehow part of a larger story they were all still discovering. Elizabeth stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Frank?" "Right here," he assured her, squeezing her hand. "Not going anywhere." "The garden," she mumbled. "We'll be fine," he promised. "Mrs. Peterson's keeping an eye on it. Says she's always wanted to try her hand at gardening." Elizabeth managed a small smile. "She'll have it completely reorganized by the time I get back." "Probably," Frank agreed, "but maybe that's not such a bad thing. Change can be good." Grace watched them, seeing how naturally they fit together, how each anticipated the other's needs. "I'll get you some ice chips," she offered, leaving them alone. "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said once Grace had gone. "I know this isn't what you signed. Up for when you offered me your guest room." Frank thought about Sarah's letter, about second chances and unexpected gifts. "Actually," he said carefully, "I think this is exactly what I signed up for. The good and the difficult. That's what—" He paused, gathering courage. "That's what love is, isn't it?" Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. It was the first time either of them had used that word for what was growing between them. "Love," she repeated softly. "Yes, I suppose it is." The monitors kept their steady rhythm as night settled over the hospital. Frank remembered another night 3 weeks ago when he'd sat beside a stranger's bed, not knowing he was watching over his own future. "Read to me?" Elizabeth asked, gesturing to her journal. "I want to hear how my words sound in your voice." So Frank read her observations about his garden, about the way morning light played on the herbs, about the bench where she'd started writing again. Through her eyes, he saw his familiar world made new. Elizabeth's recovery journal lay open on her bedside table, the latest entry unfinished. "Dizziness returned today," she'd written. "Frank noticed before I did. Saw me stumble in the garden. Sometimes I think he knows me better after 3 weeks than people I've known for years." The words trailed off there, interrupted by the episode that had sent them back to the hospital. Now Frank sat beside her bed again, but this time was different. This time he knew exactly who he was worried about. "Post-concussion syndrome," the doctor had explained. "Sometimes symptoms can worsen before they get better. We'd like to keep her overnight for observation." Frank held Elizabeth's hand, watching her sleep. The monitors beeped steadily, reminiscent of that first night, but now each sound carried more weight. In just 3 weeks, she'd become essential to his world in ways he hadn't thought possible at their age. "Dad," Grace appeared in the doorway, still in her nurse's scrubs. "How is she?" "Sleeping," he said softly. "The doctor says it's normal, but you're worried." Grace pulled up another chair. "I saw her journal when I was helping her settle in. She writes about you, you know." Frank looked up, surprised. "She does. About how you've given her back her words. How watching you in the garden makes her want to write poetry again." Grace smiled. "She's good for you too, Dad. I haven't seen you this alive since Mom." The mention of Sarah didn't hurt the way it once had. Instead, it felt right, like all of this was somehow part of a larger story they were all still discovering. Elizabeth stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Frank?" "Right here," he assured her, squeezing her hand. "Not going anywhere. The garden," she mumbled. "Will be fine," he promised. "Mrs. Peterson's keeping an eye on it. Says she's always wanted to try her hand at gardening." Elizabeth managed a small smile. "She'll have it completely reorganized by the time I get back." "Probably," Frank agreed. "But maybe that's not such a bad thing. Change can be good." Grace watched them, seeing how naturally they fit together, how each anticipated the other's needs. "I'll get you some ice chips," she offered, leaving them alone. "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said once Grace had gone. "I know this isn't what you signed up for when you offered me your guest room." Frank thought about Sarah's letter, about second chances and unexpected gifts. "Actually," he said carefully, "I think this is exactly what I signed up for. The good and the difficult. That's what—" He paused, gathering courage. "That's what love is, isn't it?" Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. It was the first time either of them had used that word for what was growing between them. "Love," she repeated softly. "Yes, I suppose it is." The monitors kept their steady rhythm as night settled over the hospital. Frank remembered another night, 3 weeks ago, when he'd sat beside a stranger's bed, not knowing he was watching over his own future. "Read to me?" Elizabeth asked, gesturing to her journal. "I want to hear how my words sound in your voice." So Frank read her observations about his garden, about the way morning light played on the herbs, about the bench where she'd started writing again. Through her eyes, he saw his familiar world made new. The real estate listings were spread across Frank's kitchen table, each one carefully annotated in Elizabeth's neat handwriting. Some were circled in red, others crossed out, creating a map of possibilities for their future. "We could just stay here," Frank said, not for the first time. "The house has plenty of room." Elizabeth looked up from the listings. "I know, and I love this house, I do. But," she trailed off, searching for the right words. "But it's mine and Sarah's house." He finished gently. "Yes, and my house is mine and John's." She reached for his hand. "Maybe we need something that's ours, a place where we're not trying to fit into spaces already filled with memories." Frank understood. Though Elizabeth had officially moved in, her own house stood empty across town. Neither of them quite ready to decide its fate. Both homes held decades of memories, beautiful ones, but sometimes overwhelming in their presence. "What about the cottage on Maple Street?" he suggested, pointing to one of the circled listings. "Walking distance to both our children, big enough garden space. And that sunroom," Elizabeth added. "Perfect for writing. You could set up an indoor herb garden for winter." They'd viewed it yesterday, both trying not to show how much they loved it. The cottage sat on a quiet street, its character reminiscent of their current homes, but somehow fresher, ready for new stories. Grace and Jennifer arrived for Sunday dinner, finding them still surrounded by listings. "You're really doing this?" Grace asked, studying the cottage listing her father had set aside. "If you're both okay with it," Elizabeth said carefully. "We know it's a big change." Jennifer picked up the photograph of the cottage. "Mum, remember what Dad always said about boats? That sometimes you need a new vessel for a new journey." Elizabeth smiled. He was full of sailing metaphors. "Sarah had garden ones," Grace added, "about transplanting and fresh soil and new growth." She touched the cottage photo. "I think they'd both understand this." Frank made coffee while the women discussed logistics. Through the window, he could see Sarah's rose garden, dormant for winter. The roses would need to be transplanted if they moved, a thought that once would have felt impossible but now seemed right. Like Elizabeth said, everything in its season. "What about our houses?" Elizabeth asked later after the children had gone. "I can't imagine selling them to strangers." Frank had been thinking about this. Grace mentioned wanting to buy this place, said she and Tom have been looking for something bigger with room for a family. "Really?" Elizabeth brightened. "Jennifer said the same about my house. She loves being near the marina, close to where she and John used to sail. It felt right, their children carrying forward the homes they'd built while they created something new together. The cottage would be smaller, but it would be theirs. A place where Sarah's roses could bloom alongside Elizabeth's daisies, where Frank's vegetables could share space with herbs for John's favorite recipes. "Should we make an offer?" Frank asked, touching the cottage listing. Elizabeth leaned against him, both of them looking at the photograph that might represent their future. "Yes," she said simply, "it's time." Frank found himself looking at Sarah's wedding album one quiet afternoon. Elizabeth was at her house, sorting through belongings with Jennifer, giving him space to think. The album's pages were well worn, filled with moments he'd revisited countless times over the years. There was Sarah, radiant in her simple dress, their first dance, their shared smile, the life ahead of them shining in their eyes. He touched the photographs gently, remembering, but for the first time, the memories brought more warmth than pain. "I think you'd approve," he said softly to Sarah's smiling image. "You always said love multiplies when you share it." The small velvet box sat on his desk, waiting. Inside was a ring he'd chosen carefully, not a diamond solitaire like he'd given Sarah, or a pearl like Elizabeth's first ring from him. This one held a sapphire, deep blue like the summer twilight when they'd first reconnected in the garden. Grace found him still looking at the album. "Mum would be happy," she said, sitting beside him. "She told me once that true love wants the beloved to be happy, even if that means loving again." Frank nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "I found Elizabeth's old poetry journal when we were packing," he finally said. "There's a poem about that summer night, about promises made under stars. I thought I'd read it to her when... You propose?" Grace finished, smiling. "Have you decided how you'll do it?" "The garden bench, where she's been writing her new poems. It feels right somehow." Elizabeth returned as evening approached, carrying a box of old photographs she wanted to share. She found Frank in the garden, tending to the winter vegetables in the greenhouse. "John and I never managed to grow tomatoes properly," she said, setting down her box. "They always got too leggy." "Sarah could never get herbs to thrive," Frank replied. "Used to say they had personalities she couldn't figure out." He straightened up, looking at Elizabeth in the soft greenhouse light. "Maybe that's why we work so well together. We fill in each other's empty spaces." She touched his arm, understanding in her eyes, like puzzle pieces that took 50 years to find their way home. The moment felt right. Frank reached into his pocket, feeling the velvet box. "I found something today," he said, leading her to their bench. "Your old poetry journal." Elizabeth's eyes widened as he handed her the worn notebook. "I thought this was lost decades ago." "Read the one about that summer night," he suggested gently. "The one about promises." She opened the journal, finding the page as if she'd written it yesterday. Her voice was soft as she read, "Under stars that witnessed youth's bold dreams. We spoke of forever, not knowing its means. Time would part us, lives would grow, but love, like starlight, travels slow. Perhaps one day, when time is right, we'll meet again beneath night's light, and find that love, though long delayed, keeps every promise youth once made." When she looked up from the page, Frank was kneeling before her, box open in his hand. "Elizabeth," he said softly, "we made a lot of promises that summer. Some we couldn't keep then, but maybe now." "Yes," she whispered before he could finish. "Yes." The sapphire caught the last light of day as he slipped it onto her finger, next to John's band that she would always wear, just as he would always. Wear Sarah's ring alongside this new symbol of love. Inside the house, Grace and Jennifer watched from the window, both crying happy tears. The family tree on the wall would need updating, they realized. Love had grown new branches once again. Together, they created a new garden design, a blueprint for their shared future. Elizabeth's artistic eye and Frank's practical knowledge merged to plan something unique, a space that would honor both their pasts while celebrating their present. The rose archway here, Frank pointed to the sketch, transplanted from Sarah's garden, and your beloved daisies along the path. Perfect for a wedding aisle, Elizabeth finished, squeezing his hand. They'd chosen to marry in the garden of their new cottage, which they'd spent weeks preparing together. The closing had gone smoothly, and spring's arrival brought new life to the landscape. Grace and Jennifer had thrown themselves into the preparations, insisting their parents deserved a proper celebration, even if an intimate one. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright. Elizabeth stood at the cottage window, watching. Frank in the garden, making final adjustments to the flower arrangements. Her wedding outfit, an elegant blue dress that matched her sapphire ring, hung ready. "Mom!" Jennifer appeared with coffee. "Grace is here. We thought you might like help getting ready." The two daughters had become inseparable during the planning, their own bond growing alongside their parents' love. They'd created a ceremony that would acknowledge all the strands of love that had brought them to this day. "The photographer's here," Grace announced, and Dad's finally stopped fussing with the roses. Elizabeth smiled, remembering another spring morning 50 years ago when she'd watched a young Frank Miller tending his family's garden. "Some things never change," she said softly. The garden was transformed. Sarah's roses and John's favorite. Nautical touches blended seamlessly with new plantings. Photos of both their families, past and present, lined the path to the rose archway. The old garden bench, their bench, had been given a place of honor. Frank waited beneath the archway, looking handsome in his dark suit. His face, when he saw Elizabeth walking toward him, escorted by both their children, held a lifetime of love, not just for her, but for everything that had brought them to this moment. The minister, who had known both families for decades, spoke of love's ability to grow in unexpected seasons. "Like the gardens Frank tends so carefully," she said, "love requires patience, nurturing, and faith that what we plant will bloom in its own time." Elizabeth had written their vows, her poet's heart finding the perfect words. "In the garden of second chances, where love blooms renewed, we plant our future together, nourished by memories, strengthened by time's wisdom, growing toward tomorrow's light." Frank's voice was steady as he repeated the words, though his eyes shone with tears. Their children stood witness, holding the rings, simple bands that would sit alongside those they already wore, adding to their story rather than replacing any chapters. "These rings," the minister said, "represent not just your love for each other, but the endless circle of love that brings us home, no matter how far we wander." The small gathering of friends and family watched as Frank and Elizabeth exchanged rings and a tender kiss. Mrs. Peterson dabbed at her eyes, whispering to Grace about how she'd known all along they were meant for each other. Afterward, they celebrated in the garden they'd created together. Tables set with Sarah's china and John's nautical centerpieces. Elizabeth's poetry books mixed with Frank's gardening guides as decorations. A perfect blend of past and present. 1 year later, Grace and Jennifer presented their parents with a memory book they'd created, chronicling the remarkable journey that had brought their families together. The leather-bound album sat open on Frank and Elizabeth's patio table, its pages telling their story through photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten memories. "Look," Elizabeth said, pointing to the first page. The article about the accident. "Local widower rescues former high school sweetheart." She smiled at Frank. "They made it sound so dramatic." "It was dramatic," he replied, touching her hand, where two rings now sat comfortably together, just not in the way they thought. Their cottage garden had flourished over the past year, becoming a testament to how love grows when properly tended. Sarah's roses climbed the archway where they'd married, while Elizabeth's daisies danced along the paths. The greenhouse produced both vegetables and inspiration. Elizabeth had published a collection of garden poems that was gaining attention in literary circles. Grace had settled beautifully into Frank's old house, expecting their first child, a girl they planned to. Named Sarah Elizabeth, Jennifer had made John's boat her home, teaching sailing lessons just as her father had. Both properties remained in the family, holding their memories while nurturing new ones. "Remember that first morning in the hospital?" Grace asked, turning. "A page in the memory book. When I found Dad holding your hand, Mom, not even knowing yet who you were." Elizabeth leaned against Frank's shoulder. "Sometimes the heart remembers what the mind forgets," she said softly. The book held everything. Their rediscovery of old letters, the dance ticket stub, Elizabeth's recovery journal, the real estate listings that had led them to their cottage. Each artifact told part of their story, building to this moment. "We thought this would be the final page," Jennifer said, reaching the end of the book. "But look, we left the rest blank. For all the stories you haven't lived yet." Frank wrapped his arm around Elizabeth, both of them looking at the empty pages with anticipation rather than uncertainty. At their age, they knew better than to take time for granted, but they also knew the value of each moment they were given. "I have something for those blank pages," Elizabeth said. She retrieved her latest poem, written that morning while watching Frank tend their garden. "Love knows no season but the present, no age but the heart's own time, no boundaries but those we transcend when we dare to bloom again. In this garden of second chances, every day plants new memories, every moment harvests joy, and together we grow ever home." Their story had become known in the community as one of hope and possibility, inspiring others to remain open to love's unexpected appearances. But for Frank and Elizabeth, it was simpler than that. They were just two people who had lived full lives, loved deeply, lost profoundly, and found the courage to love again. The afternoon light painted their garden gold as they sat surrounded by family, the memory book open to its blank pages, ready for whatever stories time would write there. Behind them, Sarah's roses and John's wind chimes created a gentle harmony, past and present, memory and moment, all blooming together in love's endless garden.